The chamber is open and full of whispers.
Before we dive in, check the link in the description if you want exclusive timelines, members-only videos you won't find on YouTube, all on our Patreon. Hermione woke on stone, not fell asleep and woke. There had been no sleep in it, no transition her mind could locate. One moment the great hall had been a wall of green light and screaming, and the specific overwhelming density of a battle reaching its final minute. The next, she was lying on her side on the flagstones, with her cheek against cold stone, and her right hand closed around something that was disintegrating between her fingers even as her consciousness reassembled itself enough to notice it. Ash. Fine, gray, still faintly warm. She did not yet know to mourn it. She opened her eyes. The first thing she registered was not absence. It was light, wrong light, a deep violet pooling down from the enchanted ceiling where the pre-dawn sky should have been, the sky that should have shown the tail end of a battle's night giving way to morning. This was not that sky. This was a color that belonged to no atmosphere she had ever stood beneath, heavy and still, like a bruise that had not finished forming. She sat up. The second thing she registered was the silence, and the silence took longer to understand than the light, because silence did not announce itself the way wrong color did. It crept in sideways. She became aware of it the way you became aware of a held breath, through the specific absence of something that should have been continuous. No wind through the broken windows. No groan of settling stone. No distant cry of someone wounded. No curse fired in a corridor 3 floors up. No creak of the castle's vast old joints adjusting to the weight of nearly 1,000 years. Nothing. She held her own breath to test it, and the silence held with her, total and complete, as if it had been waiting for her to notice it, and was now satisfied that she had. She called out, "Ron?" Her voice did not echo. This was the detail that her mind fixed on first, with the specific clinical attention that had carried her through 7 years of crises that required her not to feel things until later. A hall this size, with stone walls and a vaulted ceiling, should have returned her voice to her in fragments, layered and diminishing. It returned nothing. The sound went out from her and simply stopped, as though the air itself had lost the capacity to carry it back. She stood. The great hall was a wreck in the specific way that battlefields were wrecks. Tables overturned, the long benches scattered, scorch marks blooming black across stone that had stood since long before the ministry existed. Glass from the high windows lay in a fine scatter across the floor, catching the violet light in small, cold points. The wreckage was exactly what she would have expected to find at the end of a battle. What she found instead of bodies stopped her breath entirely. Robes. They lay where people had fallen. She could see the shape of it now, the specific quality of cloth that had held a body a moment ago and now held nothing. Fabric settled flat and empty in the precise outline of someone who was simply gone. A set of dark robes near the doors to the entrance hall, a Death Eater's mask resting beside the collar where a head should have been, a school tie still knotted, lying across an overturned bench with nothing inside the collar that held it, a pair of spectacles near the base of the staff table, one lens starred with a crack, the frame undisturbed because nothing had fallen to disturb it. She crouched beside the spectacles and could not place whose they were, and made herself stop trying, because trying required a conclusion she was not yet willing to draw. And Hermione Granger had spent her whole life refusing to draw conclusions before she had verified them. She catalogued instead. Wands scattered everywhere, more wands than there should have been people, some clearly dropped, some clearly disarmed before whatever happened. No blood. No drag marks, no signs of anyone having crawled away wounded. Just robes and wands, and the specific deflated emptiness of cloth that had stopped containing a person without any of the violence that should have accompanied a person's ending. Her face had gone the color of old bone. She did not notice this. She was already moving to the next data point, and the next, building a structure to stand inside, because the alternative was to stand in the open ground of what this actually meant, and that ground did not yet have a floor she trusted. She did not scream. She had already understood, in the part of her mind that processed faster than her conscious thought could follow, that screaming required someone to hear it, and there was no one. The understanding did not arrive as a sentence. It arrived as a physical sensation, cold moving up through her sternum, and she breathed through it in 3 measured breaths, because that was the only response currently available to her that did not require the floor to exist yet. She turned in a slow circle. Harry? No answer. no echo even. Across the hall, a door swung open on its own, not violently, not the door blown wide by some external force. It opened the way a door opened for someone who had simply pushed it, except no one had pushed it. At the same moment, far down a side corridor, whose mouth was visible through the gap, a single torch flared to life, its flame steady and orange against the violet dark. Hermione looked at the open door for a long moment. It was not a coincidence. She did not believe in those. Not anymore. Not after 7 years of a world that operated on rules even when the rules were hidden. This was the castle. Somehow, impossibly in whatever this was, the castle was still doing something. And it had opened a door and lit a torch in the specific direction that led deeper into Hogwarts rather than out of it. An invitation, or a direction. Something nearer the head of the hall held her first, though the dais, the splintered high table, the wide scorched circle burned into the stone in front of it where the last duel of the night had clearly ended. A second wand lay there, snapped clean through the middle, yew and phoenix feather spilling from the break. She recognized it. She had seen it pointed at people she loved more times than she could count, and seeing it broken and abandoned told her, with more certainty than anything else in the hall had managed, that whatever had happened here had happened after Harry won. It did not tell her where Harry was now. She was still staring at the broken wand when she heard it. Not a voice, not quite, but breath. Ragged, uneven, entirely human, coming from somewhere near the base of the dais, where an overturned bench had fallen across someone lying half in shadow. She was moving before she had finished deciding to move. He was face down amid the wreckage, one hand still loosely curled around a second wand, pale, knotted, unmistakable even in poor light, and his glasses askew but unbroken on his face. For one suspended second, her whole chest seized around the certainty that she had simply found another set of clothes with nothing left inside them. Then he stirred and groaned and turned his head, and Harry Potter opened his eyes and looked up at her out of a face streaked with ash and blood that was, as far as she could immediately tell, entirely his own and entirely alive. Hermione? His voice came out cracked, disoriented, the voice of someone surfacing from somewhere very deep. You won? She said. I think you won. Harry, can you sit up? He could, slowly, wincing, the elder wand still gripped tight in his right hand, as though some part of him had refused to let go of it, even unconscious. He looked around at the hall, at the violet light pooling from the ceiling, at the wreckage, at the doors standing open onto a darkness that had no business being so total. And Hermione watched the same understanding that had taken her several long minutes to assemble arrive in him in the space of a single look. "Where is everyone?" he said. It was not quite a question. "I don't know yet," Hermione said. "I've been trying to find out since I woke up. There's no one, Harry. Not Ron, I haven't found anyone. Just robes. Just things people were wearing." He got to his feet unsteadily. One hand braced against the broken bench, the elder wand never leaving his grip, and stood beside her in the ruined hall, looking out at a silence that had nothing left in it to disturb. "I need air," he said finally. "I need to see the grounds. I need to see if it's just in here." They went together, out through the doors that had somehow already opened themselves, into a night gone the wrong color overhead, and a forest standing dark and motionless at the world's edge. And they crossed the lawn side by side because neither of them, after everything, could bear to do it alone. The grounds opened up before them under the wrong violet sky, the forbidden forest a dark, unbroken mass at the world's edge, the lake flat and still beyond the slope of the lawn. Nothing moved. No bird crossed the sky. No creature called from the tree line. No wind stirred the grass. They stopped near the middle of the lawn, the castle rising silent behind them, the silent forest rising silent ahead, and stood for a moment without speaking. "Everyone is gone," Hermione said, not a question. A statement laid down like a stone, flat and final, the only way she could currently bear to say it. "I think so," Harry said. He was still holding the elder wand loosely at his side, as if he had not yet decided what else to do with it. "I remember the curse. I remember it rebounding. I remember falling, and then nothing. Just this." "I don't know what happened," she said. "I'm working on a theory. I think it has something to do with him," Harry said, looking back at the castle, at the violet-lit windows. "Something he did, or something that happened when he died. I don't know which yet. Both of those things might be true." Another silence. longer this time. Then she closed the gap between them and put her arms around him, and he held on, his chin against the top of her head, and above them the great hall's ceiling went on showing its impossible sky to no one but the two of them. They walked the castle together, because neither of them could bear to walk it alone. The dormitories were the worst of it, in the specific way that the smallest, most domestic details were always the worst of it. The Gryffindor common room fire had burned down to embers and gone cold in its grate, and the room held the precise wreckage of an evacuation, a half-finished game of exploding snaps scattered across a table, a cardigan draped over the back of a chair, an essay abandoned mid-sentence on a desk by the window, the quill still resting in the ink blot where its writer had set it down to go and fight. The dormitory beds were made and unmade in the chaotic pattern of people who had left in a hurry days or weeks ago and never returned to tidy them. Hermione stood in the doorway of the room that had been hers and did not go in. They climbed to the headmaster's office, the stone gargoyle standing aside without password because there was no longer a password to ask for, the spiral stair turning beneath them in the dark. The office itself was much as it had always been. The desk, the silver instruments, the shelves of curious objects that had always seemed to be quietly thinking about something. The portraits were blank, every one of them, frame after gilt frame around the curved walls, holding nothing but painted backgrounds, empty chairs, vacant landscapes, the specific quality of absence that a portrait achieved when its occupant simply was not there. The chair behind the desk where past headmasters usually held court, usually slept through everything, was empty canvas. Every headmaster who had ever watched over this room, gone. Harry stood in front of the largest of the empty frames and said nothing for a long time. A classroom on the first floor held a marking book, dated and signed, a quill set down beside it as though its owner had simply stepped out and meant to return. The owlery broke him. He had known, intellectually, what he would find. Every owl in this castle was a magical creature, and every magical creature in this world appeared to have ceased to exist at the same moment as every witch and wizard. He had built the conclusion carefully on the way up, so that the empty perches would simply confirm something he had already accepted. It did not work that way. He stood looking at the rows of bare perches, at a single gray feather caught in a tangle of straw, thinking of a snowy owl that was not here to be mourned among them because she had already been lost to him months before any of this began, lost in a hedgerow on the road out of his aunt and uncle's house. And somehow that older grief and this new vast one folded into each other until he could no longer tell where one ended and the other started. Hermione did not touch him. She stood a foot away, her hands at her sides, and let him stand there for as long as he needed to, the way she had learned to do across a year of watching grief move through him in waves that could not be hurried and should not be interrupted. When he finally turned away from the perches, his eyes were dry, but something in his face had set, the way wet clay set when it had finally been left alone long enough to hold its shape. "All right," he said. "Yes," she said. In the entrance hall in the dark, with dawn still some unmeasured time away, Harry reached for her hand, a practical gesture meant only to keep them from losing each other in the gloom of a corridor neither of them had thought to light. Every torch in Hogwarts blazed to life at once. The light came on through every corridor and every stairwell and every distant room simultaneously, a single instant of total illumination running through the entire castle the way a held breath finally released. Neither of them had cast anything. Neither of them had spoken a word. They stood in the sudden gold light and looked at each other. "That wasn't me," Harry said. "It wasn't me either," Hermione said. She looked down at their joined hands, and then up at the nearest torch, burning steady and warm where a moment ago there had been only dark, and something moved behind her eyes that was not yet understanding, but was the first shape understanding would eventually take. Dawn came at last through the entrance hall's high windows, ordinary dawn, gray-gold and entirely unremarkable, the sky over Scotland behaving exactly as it always had, indifferent to everything that had happened beneath it. They climbed the astronomy tower together to watch it arrive. The ground stretched out below them in the thin early light, the lake flat and silver, the forbidden forest a dark unbroken mass at the world's edge, the Quidditch pitch standing empty in the morning quiet. A wind had returned at some point in the night. Harry felt it now against his face. The first moving air he had registered since waking among the wreckage of the hall, and it stirred the grass below them in long, slow waves. The world continuing to behave like a world, even though almost everyone in it had ceased to exist. "We're not leaving," Harry said. It was not quite a question, but it asked for confirmation anyway. "No," Hermione said. "This is ours now. Whatever it is, whatever happened, we're going to find out, and we're going to figure out what comes next, and we're going to do it here." He looked at her. The wind moved her hair across her face, and she did not push it back. "Together," he said. "There's no other way left to do it," she said. The sun cleared the horizon fully, and threw long gold light across the grounds, across the tower, across the two of them standing at its edge, the only two people left to see it. By the third day, hunger had become a fact they had to manage, rather than a feeling they could ignore. The kitchens, when they had first descended to them on the morning after, had told its own version of the story the rest of the castle had already told. House elf magic had kept those vast ovens running and those endless tables supplied for centuries, and house elves were magical beings, and magical beings were gone. The larders held only what had never depended on an elf's hand to conjure it fresh: dried goods, a few sacks of flour gone slightly stale, and, in the back of a storeroom, neither of them had ever had reason to enter, a stock of tinned food left over from some long-abandoned Muggle studies practical, cases of it stacked against the wall under a film of dust. They had been eating from those tins for 3 days: cold beans, tinned peaches, a kind of stew that came in a can with a faded label and tasted, Hermione observed on the second night with the flat humor of someone too tired to find anything actually funny, like the inside of the can itself. Neither of them had slept more than a handful of hours at a stretch. Sleep arrived in collapses rather than decisions, the body simply refusing to continue, and woke them again within a few hours with the specific quality of dreams that left a residue they could not quite name. They had spent those 3 days doing the only thing either of them knew how to do with a catastrophe of this size. They had surveyed it. Hermione kept the findings in a notebook she had taken from a stationer's cupboard in an empty classroom, because the alternative, not writing anything down, felt to her like a kind of surrender she was not prepared to make. The notebook sat open on a table in the library, its pages filling with her small, urgent handwriting, organized into headings she revised nightly as new information arrived. Time of event: 3:47 a.m., May 2nd. This she had established by cross-referencing the last entries in 3 separate places, a clock in the headmaster's office that had stopped at that exact minute, its enchanted mechanism apparently dependent on something that had ceased to function, a half-cast timing charm on a dueling dummy in an abandoned classroom, frozen mid-effect, and more disturbingly, her own memory of the battle's last clear moments, which placed her in the Great Hall at very close to that time. Scope: total, simultaneous, non-discriminating among magical beings. Every witch and wizard, every magical creature with sufficient magical blood to register. She had confirmed this on the second day, walking the grounds and finding the lake's edge silent of merpeople, the forest silent of centaurs, even the Thestral's usual grazing ground at the forest's border standing empty of anything that left hoofprints. Non-magical objects, unaffected. The castle's stones remained. Furniture remained. Books remained, though no one remained to read most of them. Object enchantments, functional and autonomous. The staircases still moved. The suits of armor still stood ready, and on the second day one of them had inexplicably saluted Harry as he passed. An action neither of them could explain, except to note that whatever animated the armor clearly still recognized something worth acknowledging. The Great Hall's ceiling still displayed a sky, though it was, Hermione had noted with a kind of bleak professional interest, the wrong sky, a deep violet that corresponded to no atmospheric condition either of them could identify, as though the enchantment had lost whatever distant calibration kept it tethered to the actual heavens above Scotland, and was now, instead, showing them something else entirely, something on the other side of wherever the missing had gone. Wards. Decaying at the perimeter, stable at the core. This had taken longer to confirm. Hermione had walked the boundary of the school's protective enchantments on the second day, alone, while Harry slept, and had felt, rather than measured, because she had no instrument capable of measuring it, a thinning at the edges, a gradual fraying of magic that had once been maintained by dozens of active hands, and was now sustained by nothing but its own residual momentum. Voldemort, presumed destroyed along with everyone else. The broken wand on the dais was the only physical trace either of them had found of him, and a broken wand, Hermione reminded herself, writing the line, was not the same as a body. There had rarely been a body with him, but there had also, this time, been a rebounded curse and a death he had not survived even once before, and a silence that had swallowed the entire magical world in the same instant he should have fallen. And that timing, she wrote, underlined twice, cannot be coincidence. It was Harry who found the scorched circle. He had gone into the forbidden forest on the second afternoon, not deep, just past the tree line, drawn there by something he could not articulate, except to call it a feeling that the answer to what had happened was not going to be found inside the castle alone. He had walked for perhaps 20 minutes through trees that remained eerily wrongly still, and had come, without quite meaning to a clearing he did not recognize. The grass within it did not exist anymore. The ground was scorched black in a perfect circle some 50 feet across. The earth itself cracked and discolored in patterns that radiated outward from the center, like something had been driven into the soil and detonated there. At the circle's exact heart, the ground had been burned down to a kind of glassy black residue, fused and smooth, reflecting the gray daylight in a way that made Harry's stomach turn before he understood why. This was not where the duel had ended. That had happened in the great hall, on the stone where he had woken. This was something else. Something that had happened nearby, at roughly the same hour, and left no robes and no wand and no trace of a person at all, only this. He had brought Hermione back to it that same evening. She crouched at the circle's edge for a long time without touching anything, her wand raised, casting diagnostic charm after diagnostic charm in a sequence that grew increasingly frustrated as each one returned nothing useful. Readings that made no sense, magical signatures so degraded and strange that her detection spells simply failed to categorize them. "There's residue here unlike anything in any text I've read," she said finally very quietly, kneeling at the circle's perimeter. "It makes my eyes water. There's no category for it. It isn't dark magic in any classification I know, and I know most of them." "You think this is connected?" Harry said. He was not looking at the circle. He was looking at the trees around it, at the specific quality of the silence pressing in from every direction. "I think something happened here in the same hour everyone vanished. Close enough to the castle that it can't be unrelated," Hermione said, standing slowly, brushing ash from her knees with hands that were not quite steady. "I don't know yet whether it caused what happened to the world, or whether it was simply a casualty of it happening. I don't want to guess past what I can support." "He was never going to stop it killing me," Harry said slowly, even when he thought he had. "I don't think he ever really wanted to rule the world the way everyone always said. I think some part of him wanted—" He stopped, the thought arriving slower than he expected. An ordinary thought, his own, not yet touched by anything else. "What?" Hermione said. "To be the only one," Harry said. "Not the most powerful, the only one. No one left who could ever be a threat to him, because no one left who could do magic at all, except him." Hermione looked at him for a long moment, and something in her face shifted from grief into the particular sharpening she did when a theory found its shape. If he attempted something like that, in the last hour of the battle, with a soul as damaged as his, she said slowly, it would not have gone the way he intended. A ritual of that magnitude requires precision he no longer had the capacity for. So it went wrong. So if it was him, and I want to stress that we don't yet know that it was, it may have taken everyone, including in the end himself. They stood at the edge of the burnt circle as the light went gray and then dim around them, neither of them willing to be the one who suggested leaving first. And the silence of the forest pressed close around the two of them, and the black glass at the clearing's center, the only sound either of them was certain, belonged entirely to the present moment. The dreams began on the third night, and they began at exactly 3:47 a.m., and they began for both of them at once. Harry woke, gasping in the dark of the dormitory he had claimed. A hand pressed flat against his own chest, as though to confirm his heart was still where he had left it. He had been dreaming of faces. Not one face, not even a sequence of faces, but a vast simultaneous crowd of them, hundreds, layered over one another like photographs developed onto the same plate, each one present for less than an instant before another arrived to replace it. Hands, too. Dozens of hands making wand movements he had never been taught, the muscle memory of motions arriving in his own fingers as though his body had performed them 1,000 times before. He found Hermione in the corridor outside her room, already awake, already shaking, a hand braced against the stone wall to keep herself upright. "You too," she said. It was not a question. "Faces," he said. "Hundreds of them. And Knowing things. Things I haven't learned. Voices, Hermione said. Her eyes were wide, fixed somewhere past him, the specific look of someone still partly inside the experience she was describing. Not words exactly, more like the shape of words, before they become words. Like arriving in a library where every book has been thrown into the air and they're still falling, and I can see the titles passing. And I know they're going to land somewhere I can reach. But they haven't landed yet. They sat together on the cold floor of the corridor until the gray light came up at the window, neither of them willing to return to sleep, both of them turning the same unspoken thought over without saying it aloud. Because saying it aloud would make it real in a way that simply experiencing it, so far, had not quite managed to do. It's not chaos, Hermione said eventually, very quietly, mostly to herself. It's organizing. Whatever this is, it has a shape. It's just not finished falling into it yet. I fixed a ward this morning, Harry said. On the North Tower. I didn't think about how. I just knew the way you know how to walk. I could have explained it to you afterward if you'd asked. I just couldn't have explained it beforehand. Hermione turned to look at him fully for the first time since he had found her in the corridor. We're inheriting them, she said. Harry, the magic that belonged to everyone who's gone. It isn't gone with them. It's flowing somewhere, and there's nowhere left for it to flow except into the only two people still capable of holding it. He did not answer immediately. Outside, the grounds were beginning to take on color as the sun climbed, the lake going from black to gray to a dull early silver, the world continuing its old, unbothered rhythm around a silence that no longer had anyone in it to notice the rhythm, but the two of them. He became aware, in the quiet that followed, of something new at the very edge of his attention. Not a sound, not quite a feeling, but a presence, low and constant, like warmth radiating from a nearby fire he could not see. He looked at Hermione and understood, without being told, that she had become aware of the same thing in him at the same moment. A second heartbeat, steady and warm, running just alongside his own. By the 14th day, Hermione had not slept in the dormitory for nearly 2 of them. She had taken over the library in the specific total way she had always quietly wanted to and never quite admitted. Every table along the central aisle pressed into service, covered now with parchment and quill marks in a density that would have alarmed the school librarian into an early grave. Notebooks lay open 3 and 4 deep, cross-referenced with string and small torn flags of paper marking pages she meant to return to. She had been awake, by Harry's count, for the better part of 46 hours. She was not transcribing knowledge that needed to be looked up. She did not need to look anything up anymore. That was the entire vertiginous point. What she was building in those dense ranked pages was a map of a country whose entire territory she had woken up one morning, already standing inside. Taxonomy, she had written at the top of the central notebook, underlined twice. Beneath it, branching categories in her small, precise hand, ward architecture, potion theory both base and advanced, transfiguration animate and structural, curse and counter-curse theory, healing both physical and magical trauma, arithmancy foundational and applied to large-scale enchantment. The list ran to 4 pages before she had stopped to eat anything, and even then she had eaten standing at the shelf with a tin of peaches in one hand and a quill in the other. Harry found her there on the morning of the 14th day with a fresh page open before her and an expression on her face that he had only seen a handful of times in 7 years. The specific stillness of someone who had just done arithmetic that frightened them. How many spells, she said, without looking up, do you think the average witch or wizard knew in their working lifetime? I don't know. A few hundred? That's roughly what I'd estimate too, working backward from what I now know about typical curricula and typical careers. Somewhere between 300 and 400, as a conservative figure. She turned the notebook to face him. Rows of figures, painstakingly built up from population estimates she had pieced together from fragments of ministry record-keeping she now somehow had complete recall of. There were, by my best reconstruction, somewhere in the region of 900,000 magical beings on Earth at the moment of the pulse. Witches, wizards, and creatures with sufficiently developed magical cognition to count as practitioners in their own right. That's not Hermione, that's not very many people, for the whole world. No, it isn't. The wizarding world was always small. That's precisely what makes the number that follows so disturbing. She tapped the next line. If even a third of those 900,000 possessed unique knowledge, A technique, a variant, a piece of regional tradition that existed nowhere else, that still hundreds of thousands of distinct contributions. Add in everyone who simply taught something well, whose particular way of explaining a concept made it accessible in a way no textbook ever has. Add every healer's private innovation, every duelist's signature counter. She set the quill down. We don't have some of it, Harry. We have all of it. Every tradition. Every dead language of spellcraft. Every regional school of practice that never got written down because it didn't need to be, because it simply lived in living people, passed hand to hand. She said this last part quietly, not triumphantly. The weight of it sat in the room with them, heavier than either of the empty chairs around the table. We have it all, she said again. Harry had spent that same fortnight outside. Not avoiding her, he had told her so directly. On the fourth day, when she had asked with the careful neutral tone she used when she was worried she'd given offense, without meaning to. He simply could not sit still with what was happening to him the way she could. Whatever the inheritance was doing to her arrived as architecture, as systems she could lay flat on a page and study. What it was doing to him arrived as want, an itch in his hands to test something, to see if a thing he had just half remembered was real. He had started small. Standing at the edge of the lake on the 7th day, he had knelt and put his bare hand flat against the water's surface, and had known, instantly, without working for it, that there were still grindy lows down in the silt at the lake's deepest point, creatures with too little magic in their blood to have registered as a target for the pulse. He felt their small, malevolent presence, the way you might feel a draft under a closed door. By the 12th day, he had taught himself, or rather remembered, 17 potions whose ingredients he could name in order without ever having brewed them. He had begun speaking twice now, in languages he had never studied. Once a fragment of Latin so old it predated the standard incantations by centuries. Once something that felt, on his tongue, like a kind of Gaelic that had not been spoken aloud by a living person in a very long time. Both times he had stopped himself partway through, startled by his own voice. It did not feel like learning. It felt like being slowly, gently inhabited by a chorus that had not yet finished agreeing on its key. She called him into the library on the evening of the 14th day, and the conversation that followed was the one neither of them had quite been ready to have until that moment arrived to force it. She had the map spread across the central table, not a literal map, but the closest visual she had been able to construct. Concentric rings of categorized knowledge, each ring annotated, the whole thing radiating outward from a center she had simply labeled us. By my count, she said, there were somewhere near 900,000 magical beings on Earth at the time of the pulse. Every one of them contributed something. We have it all, she said, and this time her voice did not carry triumph. It carried the specific weight of someone laying down a burden by describing its size. Harry looked at the rings of writing. He picked up the Elder Wand from where it lay on the table beside her notebooks, turning it once in his fingers, and then, without entirely deciding to, the way the last fortnight had taught him things sometimes simply happened before he chose them. He closed his eyes and asked it silently to show him something he had not yet found on his own. What came was not vision in the ordinary sense. It arrived the way the languages had arrived, the way the potions had arrived, already complete, already moving. A woman with skin like dark river stone stood in firelight somewhere far south of anywhere Harry had ever been, shaping flame between her bare hands into characters of some script he had never seen. A man stood alone on flat white ice beneath an aurora, navigating not by stars, but by the pull of the world's own deep magical currents, running invisible beneath the frozen ground. A figure in dust-colored robes folded something small and broken into something whole again, in a chamber lined floor to ceiling with clay jars, with the patient precision of someone for whom failure had simply never been an acceptable outcome. Then, a dark-haired man of perhaps 40, tired in the particular way of someone who has been awake managing other people's catastrophes for far longer than was reasonable, kneeling at the convergence of green hills, pressing both palms flat to the earth, speaking to it as though it could hear him and had, on more than one occasion, answered. Then, gently, almost reluctantly, blue eyes behind half-moon spectacles, long hands arranging small silver instruments on a crowded desk, a face that carried, even in memory, the specific cost of every kindness it had ever extended and every secret it had ever kept. Not the legend, the man. And then Lily Potter, sitting at a desk with parchment in front of her, a quill held at an angle that snapped Harry's breath out of him entirely, because it was the exact angle at which he held his own quill. Inherited not from memory, but from blood, confirmed now by something far stranger than blood. He set the wand down. "Okay," he said. "Okay?" Hermione looked up from her notebook. "I understand now what we are." He looked at his own hands as though they belonged briefly to someone else. "I thought I might be, I don't know, a repository, a library that walks around. But it isn't like that." He searched for it and found, surprisingly, that the word arrived easily, as though it too had been waiting in the chorus for him to need it. It's us, everything they were, filtered through everything we already are. "A synthesis," Hermione offered quietly. "Yes, we're not them," Harry said. "We're not even an average of them. He stopped, met her eyes. "We're better than any of them could have been alone. Because we have what they each had, separately, all at once." Hermione was quiet for a moment. It was not a comparison she would ordinarily have permitted herself. She had spent her whole life believing in the people she'd studied, in a kind of careful reverence too deep to casually place herself above. But she had felt the same truth arriving in her own inheritance over the last 14 days, undeniable and total, and she did not argue with it now. "We have a responsibility," she said instead, "to do something worthy of what they gave us." "They didn't give it," Harry said. "It just happened. Which means we have a debt we can never repay and never agreed to take on, which is a deeply uncomfortable position to be in." She laughed, a short, startled sound, the first laughter to occur in the library or anywhere else in the castle, in 2 weeks, and for a moment, the violet ceiling overhead, and the empty chairs around them, and the silent absences pressing in from every direction of the world, receded just slightly, just long enough for the two of them to sit together in a quiet that, for the first time since the pulse, did not feel entirely unbearable. The instrument that warned them was one of Hermione's own making, assembled over the following week from a dozen older detection charms she had inherited the theory for, and rebuilt from first principles into something far more sensitive than anything the old Ministry's Department of Magical Law Enforcement had ever fielded. It sat on a windowsill in the library, a small brass ring suspended on a thread above a shallow basin of still water, and on the morning of the 29th day it began, without warning, to turn. Hermione found it spinning when she came down at dawn. The water beneath it had developed a fine concentric ripple, radiating outward from the ring's shadow in a pattern she recognized immediately, because the recognition arrived the way all her recognitions arrived now, instant, complete, inherited from someone who had built instruments exactly like this one centuries before her, and never lived to see them improved upon. "Movement," she said when Harry came in still half asleep, drawn by the change in her voice from the corridor outside. "Mechanical movement. Vehicles, possibly aircraft. Approaching from the south-southwest. Muggles. Muggles with very sophisticated instruments, judging by the signature." She bent closer to the ripple pattern. "And they are not wandering. They are searching." The Veil of Nations existed by the time the search party came within detection range, only as theory and 3 weeks of Hermione's increasingly dense calculations. But theory, built from an inheritance this deep, was not the same fragile thing theory had once been for either of them. She had spent the preceding fortnight mapping what she now understood to be the original architecture behind Hogwarts' oldest protections, the layered work of the school's founders, who had built not merely a wall around a school, but a relationship between a building and the land that held it. What she proposed was not a wall. A wall could be measured against, probed, eventually breached by patience and instruments. What she proposed was redirection, not stopping anyone from approaching, but making the approach itself feel, to a mind without magic in it, like the wrong decision, not a crude individual confusion charm, the bewildering of a single mind in a single moment, but something applied at the level of the land's own magical field, an ambient suggestion laid into the very current surrounding the highlands, so that anyone without magical blood who came within its reach simply found, gradually and without alarm, that their attention had drifted somewhere else, that the weather looked worse than it had a moment ago, that whatever they had come to find was clearly not here, and something more urgent was waiting elsewhere. "It isn't lying to them," Hermione said, laying the calculation out before Harry on the library table. Lines of arithmancy notation running down both margins in handwriting that had grown over the past month, almost unrecognizably fast and certain. "It's persuading the part of them that decides what's worth their attention, No one will remember being stopped. They'll simply remember changing their mind. And if someone's mind is harder to change, then the field gets stronger the closer they come. By the time they're within a mile of the boundary, changing their mind will feel, to them, like the only sane thing left to do. Harry looked at the notation for a long moment, not because he needed to verify it. Some quieter, more instinctive part of him had already confirmed it was sound, the way he could now confirm the soundness of 100 things he had never been formally taught, but because watching her build it, line by line, filled him with something close to awe that had nothing to do with magic at all. "Where do we cast it from?" he asked. She looked up, and something in her expression told him she had been waiting for this question, had perhaps even been a little afraid of it. "There's a chamber beneath the dungeons," she said. "I found the stair behind a loose flagstone 2 weeks ago, and didn't tell you because I wasn't certain what it was until last night." She paused. "I think it's the reason Hogwarts was ever built here at all." The stair went down for longer than either of them had expected, the air growing warmer rather than colder as they descended, until it opened at last into a chamber that bore no resemblance to anything else in the castle above it. There was no masonry here. The walls were raw bedrock, uncut and ancient, giving off a faint internal glow the color of banked embers, as though the stone itself had been smoldering for longer than human memory extended. The air was thick in a way that pressed gently against the skin, dense with something that was not quite magic in the ordinary sense. Magic before it had been shaped into spells. Magic the way ore existed before it became metal. Harry walked to the center of the chamber and knelt, placing both palms flat against the bedrock floor. The response was immediate and enormous. He felt the deep, magical currents running beneath Britain the way he had once felt his own pulse, present, steady, and now, abruptly aware of him, the way a vast sleeping animal might become aware of a hand resting on its flank. Hermione came to stand facing him and began to speak. Not an incantation, but mathematics given voice, sequences of numbers and geometric ratios, the architecture of a field described in pure relational terms. Where Harry was opening a door, she was drawing the shape of the room beyond it, line by precise line. The bedrock began to hum beneath Harry's palms, the embered glow deepening to a warm amber that spread upward, climbing the chamber's rough sides. The casting took 4 hours. Neither of them spoke once it began in earnest, and by the 3rd hour sweat stood out along Hermione's hairline. Her voice dropped to something close to a whisper, that the chamber itself seemed to carry without effort. When it ended, the amber light folded back into the walls, leaving them dim and warm, and the silence that followed had a different quality than the silence either of them had grown used to over the past month. Fuller, somehow, as if the chamber had simply exhaled. They climbed back to the surface in the early evening and found a castle that felt, in some way neither of them could precisely articulate, more settled than it had been that morning, as though Hogwarts itself had taken a long breath it had been holding since the 2nd of May, and had finally, quietly, let it go. Hermione's brass instrument, when she checked it in the library window, hung perfectly still above its basin. No ripple disturbed the water. 3 miles south, where a Muggle reconnaissance team had been steadily closing on the Highlands for the better part of a day, the satellite link feeding their position back to London began returning, instead of coordinates, a flat and featureless static. Harry stood at the top of the astronomy tower as the light went down over the grounds, and for the first time since waking in the ruined Great Hall, he did not feel hunted. "Someone once told me this was the safest place in the world," he said, when Hermione joined him at the parapet. "Whoever told you that was right," she said, looking out at the dark, settled lake, the silent forest, the boundary now humming somewhere beyond sight with the patient amber pulse of a wall that had nothing to do with stone. "They just didn't know yet that the reason would eventually be us." 6 weeks had passed since the pulse, and a rhythm had settled over the castle that neither of them had planned, but both of them had needed. Mornings spent in study, the inheritance arriving now in gentler waves that left room for deliberate practice rather than overwhelming flood. Afternoons given to the practical labor of keeping Hogwarts itself alive, the vegetable garden behind the greenhouses. Coaxed back from neglect, the kitchen taps that Hermione had finally learned to operate without an elf's hand to guide the spellwork. Evenings, always, in the Great Hall, eating together at a single small table set near the hearth, rather than at the vast empty length of the house tables, because the house tables had felt, from the first night, like a wound neither of them wanted to sit beside. Harry had not touched the resurrection stone since the morning he had first noticed it cold against his hip, having carried it through the battle in his pocket and never once thought to use it since. He kept it in a small box on the windowsill of his room, and some part of him had known, without examining the knowledge too closely, that the day would come when he reached for it, and that the day would not come on a schedule he could plan in advance. Hermione had not raised the subject. She had understood since the third week, watching him pass the box without looking at it, that grief moved at its own pace, and that summoning the dead and then losing them a second time was not a wound either of them could afford to reopen carelessly. On the morning of the 6th-week anniversary, without discussing it, he went and got the box. Hermione had been preparing for this for 2 weeks, since the evening he had first mentioned it in passing, almost carelessly, the way people mentioned things they were testing the weight of before committing to saying them properly. She had not pushed. She had simply begun designing, quietly, in the margins of her other work, a framework that would let whatever came through the stone stay rather than flicker and fade the way the old tales described, present for minutes, not nights, and never able to be touched at all. "I want to be honest with you about what this is," she said, before they began laying the finished design out on the table between them. "Every account I've ever read says the stone alone cannot do this. What it brings back is meant to be a shadow, close but cold, never quite present, never meant to be kept. I'm not using the stone alone. I'm building something around it, an anchoring, drawing on the same kind of binding I've been studying in the oldest love magic theory, strong enough to hold a presence steady instead of letting it flicker. This will let them stay longer, and perhaps even be touched, in a way the old stories say should not be possible. I don't fully know yet what that will cost, if anything. I wanted you to know that going in, rather than discover it partway through." Harry considered this for a long moment, the box held loosely in his hands. "If it doesn't work the way the old stories say it should," he said finally, "I'd rather know that going in too. Let's try it properly then." The anchoring protocol, when she finally finished laying it out for him in full, was not powerful in the way the Veil of Nations had been powerful. It was precise in a way that frightened her more than raw force ever had. 4 discrete points within the fabric of the Great Hall, each one tuned to receive and hold a single specific resonance, built from a combination of the stone's own summoning principle and the gentler love magic theory she had been quietly developing since the day she first found herself wondering, with an ache she hadn't expected, what protective magic born purely of love might actually feel like to perform. They cast it together in the great hall as the afternoon light slanted gold through the high windows. Harry held the stone in his closed fist. Hermione stood facing him, her wand tracing the 4 points of the chamber in a sequence so careful it took the better part of an hour, her voice low and even, building the resonant frame stone by invisible stone, the way she had built the chamber below the dungeons weeks before. When it was ready, Harry closed his eyes and turned the stone 3 times in his palm, and spoke their names. Sirius Black, James Potter, Lily Evans Potter, Remus Lupin. They came slowly, the way photographs developed in a dark room. First a suggestion of shape against the air, then edges, then the specific impossible solidity of someone you had loved and lost standing in a room with you again. Sirius arrived laughing. It was the first thing he did, before he had even fully resolved into shape, a sound of pure reflexive delight, the laugh of someone who has just discovered, against every reasonable expectation, that he still exists in some form capable of laughing. Then his eyes found Harry, properly found him, and the laugh folded into something else, something raw and unguarded that Sirius Black, who had spent his whole life performing a careless ease even at his worst moments, did not bother trying to hide. He reached out, half expecting his hand to pass through empty air the way the old stories said it should, and stopped, startled, when his fingers actually met the fabric of Harry's sleeve, faint resistance where there should have been none at all. Hermione's design had held. He stood close, examining Harry's face with the focused, hungry attention of someone cataloging every change in a person they loved. "You got taller," he said. "That's what you open with?" Harry's voice cracked slightly on the second word. "You did, though," Sirius said, "and you look like your dad, more than you used to." James and Lily arrived together hand in hand, and stood looking at their son with an expression that had no clean translation into language. The specific impossible mixture of pride and grief and wonder that belonged only to parents watching a child become something they had hoped for and never quite dared to imagine. Lily spoke first. "Oh, sweetheart," she said. And that was all. It was everything. Remus came last, and quietly, the way he had always done everything, entering a room without disturbing its air, his presence announcing itself only once you noticed it was there. He inclined his head to Harry, then to Hermione, his eyes moving across her face with a gentleness that nearly undid her composure entirely. "Tell me what happened," he said. "All of it. I want to know." They talked through the night. A fire burning in the hearth Hermione had conjured for atmosphere rather than warmth. Harry and Hermione sat close together on a transfigured bench, and the four silver-gray figures arranged themselves loosely around them, the conversation moving without hurry, the way conversations moved among people who had once had all the time in the world. They explained the pulse, what little they understood of its mechanics, the scorched circle in the forest, the theory of a ritual that had likely consumed its own caster along with everyone else. "Where are you, actually?" Harry asked, the question he had been holding back since the moment they arrived. "What's it like?" "It's not what I expected," Sirius said gently. "I can't describe it properly. I've tried, but I can tell you it isn't bad." Harry told them, slowly, about the inheritance, the languages, the potions, the faces that arrived behind his eyes when he closed them, the way the Elder Wand had shown him visions of people he had never met. James leaned forward at this. "Harry," he said, "you were marked out by Voldemort because of a prophecy neither of us ever fully understood while we were alive. Don't mistake what you're doing now for what that prophecy required of you. You were always going to be extraordinary, with or without him. This is what you've chosen to become, not what you were assigned." Hermione had been quieter than the others might have expected, watching Lily's face with the particular intensity of someone working up to a question that mattered more than she wanted to admit. "Mrs. Potter," she said finally, "I need to ask you something." "Lily, please," Lily said gently. "Call me Lily." "Your protection," Hermione said. "What you did, at the end. I've been studying the theory behind it for weeks. The little of it that survives in any text. I think it might be part of the reason the world can come back at all. But I need to understand it properly, not as theory, as something you actually did and felt while you did it." Lily looked at her for a long moment, something thoughtful and tender passing behind her gray, translucent eyes. "Ask me anything you want to know," she said. Dawn arrived gray-gold at the high windows, and the four shades began to fade. Before he went, Sirius fixed Harry with a look that had the weight of a hand on his shoulder. "You and Hermione," he said, "take care of each other." "Always," Harry said. "You know that." "I know," Sirius said. "I just needed to say it out loud. Someone has to make sure you don't do anything stupid without me here to talk you out of it." "Hermione does that. See?" The ghost of his old grin again, brighter this time. "Just before the light took him entirely. You've already got a system." They were gone with the first true light, leaving the great hall in a silence that felt, for the first time in 6 weeks, like a silence that had something gentle folded inside it, rather than only absence. Hermione sat with the fire burning low, and the morning sky finally, properly blue gold at its eastern edge, and after a long while she said quietly, "Are you all right?" Harry considered the question honestly, the way the last 6 weeks had taught him to consider everything. "No," he said, "but I'm better than I was." She reached across and took his hand, and the torches along the hall's walls brightened, very slightly, of their own accord. 3 months after the pulse, the inheritance had given them theory in abundance and physical resource in almost none, and Hermione had reached the point in her work where theory alone had stopped being sufficient. "We have the knowledge of how a restoration might be possible," she said, laying her notes out across the library table on a gray morning in late July. "What we don't have is anything to anchor it to beyond what's already inside us. Older alchemical notes, if they exist anywhere outside legend, will not be sitting in a Hogwarts classroom. There is exactly one institution in this country that was built to outlast the people who used it." "Gringotts," Harry said. "Gringotts," she agreed, "which is now, as far as either of us can determine, completely empty of staff and completely full of everything that staff was ever paid to protect." They flew to London on the morning of the 4th of August, on brooms drawn from the Quidditch supply shed in the absence of any better transport. Harry on his old firebolt, kept maintained out of an attachment he had never bothered to examine too closely, and Hermione on a school broom that had clearly seen better decades. The flight south took most of the morning. Beneath them, The Vale of Nations held the highlands in its quiet, amber-edged hush, and beyond its boundary the ordinary world simply continued, motorways threading between green fields, the occasional small town going about its Tuesday with no idea what had happened above it weeks before, no idea that the world's entire invisible second layer had gone silent at 3:47 a.m. on a night in May. London itself was strange in a way neither of them had fully prepared for. It was not destroyed. It was, if anything, worse than destroyed. Intact, functioning, entirely indifferent. They flew in low under disillusionment, dropping toward the narrow brick mouth of Charing Cross, and found the leaky cauldron exactly where it had always been, its sign creaking faintly on a windless afternoon, its door unlocked because no one had ever returned to lock it. Diagonally beyond it was a street caught mid-breath. Shop awnings hung at their usual angles. Merchandise sat undisturbed in windows, cauldrons stacked in pyramids, robes on their stands. Owl perches stood empty outside the post office. A single quill, dropped or set down mid-purchase, lay on the cobblestones outside a writing supply shop, undisturbed by wind or rain in 3 months. Hermione stopped outside the alley's largest bookshop and went in without speaking. She moved through the shelves with the focused, almost reverent care of someone visiting a grave rather than browsing a bookshop, and Harry, following a few steps behind, understood without being told that this was not a stop for supplies. She selected 3 books, texts on theoretical arithmancy, on the structural mathematics of large-scale enchantment, material she almost certainly already carried complete and perfect within her own inheritance, and carried them to the counter. She set them down. She took out a scrap of parchment and a self-inking quill from her bag, and wrote in her careful hand a note explaining exactly what she had taken and why, addressed to no one, and left it weighted under an ink bottle on the counter beside the till. Harry read it over her shoulder and said nothing. He understood. There was no one left to receive the courtesy. She extended it anyway, because some part of her had decided, somewhere in the silence of the last 3 months, that there were still ways to behave decently, even when decency had stopped having an audience. Gringotts' bronze doors stood open. They had not closed automatically, because there had been no goblin hand to close them, and the great marble hall beyond stretched away under its chandeliers in a cool, undisturbed light that fell on rows of empty counters and the long, unattended length of polished stone where customers had once queued. The chandeliers themselves still burned. The lifts, somewhere below, could be heard humming faintly, a sound that Hermione found, after 3 months of total silence, almost startling in its ordinariness. It was built to need almost no conscious management, she said, looking around the vast empty hall. That's precisely why it's still running. The goblins built this place to outlast its own staff, in a sense. They simply never imagined the staff themselves would be the thing it had to outlast. A great curtain of enchanted water met them at the entrance to the lower vaults, hissing down into its stone channel with the same patient menace it had always carried. The kind of ancient ward built to strip away disguise and false enchantment from anyone who approached uninvited. Hermione stood before it for a long moment, then began to speak, not English, but a low, guttural sequence of sounds that arrived from somewhere deep in the inheritance, second-hand and strange on her tongue. The rudimentary rune language of goblin warding, passed to her through the memories of wizards who had spent careers working alongside goblin scholars and absorbing fragments of a tongue that was never meant to be easily learned. She told the water, in its own grammar, that they were authorized. It was not, strictly, a lie. There was no one left in the world who could conceivably grant or withhold that authorization, except the 2 of them. The water parted briefly, just enough to let them pass beneath it dry. A dragon waited at one of the deepest levels, chained and pale, its scales grown thick and crusted from long years spent without sunlight, guarding a tier of vaults that had clearly never been the one Harry remembered escaping past during the war. This one had never been ridden out into open sky. It had simply been left, like everything else, the moment its keepers ceased to exist. Harry approached it alone, leaving Hermione at the passage mouth with a brief look that asked for trust, and received it without question. He came forward slowly, his hands visible and empty, and when he was close enough that the creature's vast head turned toward the sound and smell of him, he began to speak, not quite a language, but something adjacent to one, a register of low sound and steady presence that an inheritance of careful, patient creature handling understood, with absolute certainty, that this animal had never once in its long captivity been touched by anything resembling kindness. The dragon was confused first, then still, then, gradually, beneath Harry's palm pressed flat against the rough heat of its flank, something in its enormous old body simply let go of a tension it had carried for longer than either of them could measure. He sat with it for the better part of 20 minutes while Hermione moved past, into the deeper vaults, working her way through ledgers and seals with the same patient precision she brought to everything. When she finally came looking for him, she found him seated against the dragon's side, the great head lowered, half dozing, and she stood in the passage mouth and looked at the scene for a long moment before saying, with the particular dry affection she reserved only for him, "Of course you did." The vaults gave up a great deal. The Potter family vault, first, Harry's by right since birth, holding generations of accumulated gold, and beneath it, older things, documents in his grandfather's hand, an old signet ring, small, domestic relics of a family line that had simply continued, unremarkably, for generations before any of it became remarkable. A second vault, inherited through Sirius, held considerably more gold and weight, old family correspondence, carefully quarantined dark artifacts that Hermione catalogued and sealed without touching, and a written history of a family whose obsession with its own purity had, in the end, mattered to absolutely no one but itself. Beyond these, in a category the bank had labeled in perpetuity, no living heir, were vaults full of scrolls and hands, and scripts from every corner of a world that had once, briefly, all gone magic together. Casting records of practitioners who had advised ancient courts in secret, fragments of traditions that had never crossed paths with European wizardry at all. The Hogwarts founding vault held the school's own bones, architectural notes in several distinct hands, and sealed boxes of old heirlooms that Hermione catalogued carefully, mindful that whatever still slept in this castle's oldest history deserved more caution than curiosity alone could justify. It was in the deepest of the academic vaults, in a box that had clearly not been opened in centuries, that Hermione found the scroll. The hand was old, the ink browned, the title written in a careful formal English that had aged but not faded. On the restoration of the world's magic, should it ever be lost, being the considered notes of an alchemist of long years and longer patience. She did not open it there. She held it the way she might have held something alive, and carried it back through the vault corridors to where Harry was waiting, and showed it to him without a word. "Someone anticipated this," she said finally. "Centuries before it happened, someone worried that something like this could happen to the world, and wrote down what to do about it." Harry looked at the brittle, careful handwriting, at the patience of someone who had clearly spent a very long life solving problems other people had not yet imagined existed, and felt something in his chest that was almost, despite everything, a kind of laughter. "Of course they did," he said. "Of course someone that paranoid thought to prepare for this before it ever happened." The scroll, once unrolled fully across the library table, gave them theory of a kind neither of them had quite anticipated, even after months of inheriting the accumulated wisdom of a vanished world. It was not a spell. It was closer to a warning wrapped around an instruction. Centuries of one careful mind's foresight distilled into ink-faded English, describing a process that required not merely power, but a depth of mastery neither Harry nor Hermione, for all they now carried, actually possessed yet. The author had understood something that took Hermione 3 full readings to accept, that knowing how a thing worked and being capable of doing it were not the same accomplishment, and that the gap between them for a working of this magnitude was measured not in effort, but in years. "We don't have years," Harry said, on the evening she finally explained the problem to him in full. "Every month we wait, the Muggle world gets a little closer, and whatever's left of the magical field gets a little thinner." "We don't have years in the world outside this castle," Hermione said slowly, and he watched the specific quality settle over her face that meant a solution was assembling itself faster than her voice could keep pace with it. "But that isn't the only kind of time there is." She explained it to him over the following 2 days, building the theory out of 3 separate threads of inheritance she had been quietly holding apart, until she understood how they fit together. Her own resonance with a time-turner she had worn around her neck every day of her 3rd year, the inherited memory of careful, methodical researchers who had spent careers studying the difference between moving through time and simply making it move differently around you, and the room of requirement, which had revealed itself on the 2nd day she went looking, not as a door, but as a question waiting patiently to be asked correctly. Not time travel, she said, pacing the length of the library with her hands moving as though she were physically shaping the concept in the air before her. We are not going backward. We are not creating loops. We are not risking the kind of paradox that destroyed every time turner the Ministry ever held. This is dilation. A bubble of time that simply moves more slowly than the time outside it. 1 year passes here, in the world. Inside the room, properly configured, 10 years pass for us. 10 years, Harry repeated. 10 years to master what that scroll is asking of us. 1 year, outside, while the veil holds and nothing in the wider world has time to find us. He looked at her for a long moment. At the dark crescents beneath her eyes that 3 months of grief and labor had carved there, at the steadiness in her hands despite everything, and felt something settle in him that was not quite decision yet, but was very close to it. 10 years, just the two of us, in a room, he said. Yes. All right, he said. Let's do it properly then. The room of requirement gave them what they asked for without argument. A long chamber with stone walls that did not echo, windows that showed a sky calibrated to mimic the ordinary turning of seasons outside, a fireplace that never wanted for wood, a kitchen that supplied itself from some pantry logic neither of them ever bothered questioning too closely. Hermione built the dilation field into its threshold over the course of a final, careful week, checking the mathematics 4 separate times before she would let either of them cross it. They stepped through together on the first morning of September. Year 1 belonged to argument as much as to study. Hermione wanted foundation laid systematically. Harry wanted to put his hands on the work immediately and correct for failure as it arose. What they discovered by year's end was that neither approach alone produced what the other's correction did. Hermione's frameworks gave Harry's instincts a shape to land inside. Harry's willingness to attempt the impossible gave Hermione's theory the friction it needed to become more than elegant and untested. Year 3 brought the first real breakthrough when they descended together to the chamber beneath the dungeons and successfully redirected a fractional flow of magic some distance south. Proof that intention applied with sufficient precision could reshape the network itself rather than merely draw from it. They celebrated quietly that night with a bottle from the Hogwarts cellars and talked for the first time in months about something other than the work. "What do you want?" Hermione asked, "when it's over. Properly over." "A garden," Harry said. "Somewhere I plant something and just watch it grow." "I want to read something that isn't instruction," she said. "A novel. Something with no spell in it whatsoever." Year 5 gave them the first wordless casting, when Hermione reached for the shape of an intention and found Harry already there, already moving with her, no spoken cue between them at all. They described it to the council on their next outside visit. Sirius asked what it had felt like. "Like thinking with 2 minds," Harry said. "But only one thought." "That's not magic," Lily said softly. "That's love." Year 7 completed the great mapping, Hermione finishing a chart of every deep nexus point on Earth. Year 9 belonged to Harry alone, a total accounting of the Elder Wand's true capacity, drawn from the memory of every master who had ever held it. He concluded that its capacity dwarfed every historical use anyone had found for it. It had been wielded for murder, for conquest, and by at least one master who understood its danger better than the rest. Carefully, almost reluctantly, by the end of that 9th year, Harry used it the way a craftsman used the finest tool available. Year 10 ended on a morning that mirrored with deliberate precision the morning they had entered. They stepped back through the threshold into a world where exactly 1 year had passed, September of 1999. The castle outside unchanged in its bones, but the 2 people stepping through the doorway no longer in any way that mattered, the same 2 people who had walked in. The council was waiting for them in the great hall when they emerged. Sirius looked at them for a long moment, and said finally, in a voice that had lost none of its old irreverence even after death, "Well, look at the 2 of you." Lily said nothing for a long moment, simply looking at her son and the woman standing beside him with an expression that held, in equal measure, pride and something close to awe. "Look at them," she finally agreed very softly. It was Hermione who found the anomaly in the 2nd week after their emergence, and she found it because she had built her instruments to a degree of sensitivity that nothing in the old ministry's arsenal had ever approached. The reading was small, a drain, not a deliberate, accounted-for draw the way she and Harry drew on the deep currents, but something parasitic, feeding without pattern or purpose on the ambient field itself. "Something is feeding," she said, setting the device on the table between them. Not us. Not anything we've accounted for. It's small, vanishingly small, which is exactly why we never noticed it. In a world with 900,000 magical beings, this would have been background noise. In a world with 2, it's no longer negligible. They traced it together over the following days, and the tracing brought them, with a dread neither of them spoke aloud until they had no choice, back to the scorched circle in the forbidden forest. The black glass at its center had not weathered in over a year. If anything, it looked worse. The surface clouded now in a way it had not been before, as though something beneath it had begun very slowly to stir. Hermione knelt at the circle's edge with every diagnostic spell her decade of inherited mastery could produce. And what came back this time was not the useless static her instruments had returned over a year ago. It was a signature, faint, fragmentary, but unmistakably patterned, the specific magical fingerprint of a man who had spent decades splitting his soul into pieces until nothing about it behaved the way a soul was meant to behave. "It's him," Harry said. He did not phrase it as a question. "Not him," Hermione said carefully. "Not in any sense that would mean anything to ask it a question, or reason with it, or threaten it. Whatever soul fragments he had left should have passed through the pulse, the way everyone else's did. But his soul was never whole to begin with. I think it simply passed through wrong, the way water passes through something with no shape left to hold. So it stayed. It stayed, not as the man he was. Just, she searched for the word, and the inheritance, vast and ancient as it was, offered her nothing precise enough, so she built it herself. A wraith. A parasite. The last fragment of something with every part of it stripped away, except the one instinct that was always, underneath everything else, the only thing actually driving him: hunger. She mapped its behavior over the following weeks. At its current rate, she told Harry, in approximately 6 months it will be strong enough to attempt active interference with the deep currents directly. In a year, it could be strong enough to interfere with something far more dangerous than a fluctuation in a field reading. The restoration. If it learns to draw power away from us at the critical moment of casting, yes, we would not simply fail. We could make things considerably worse. "Can we destroy it?" Harry asked. "Yes," Hermione said, "but not yet. Not carelessly. If we engage it now, we risk driving it deeper into the network, somewhere we can't easily reach. We need it to come to us. We need to choose the ground." "You want to use the restoration as bait?" he said. She held his gaze without flinching. "I want to use it as a trap." The redesign took the better part of a month, the two of them reworking the entire architecture of the old scrolls casting to serve a function its original author had never imagined it might need to serve. Not merely the redistribution of the world's magical field, but a structure that would, at its moment of greatest power, concentrate and funnel the wraith into a single fixed location. They chose Glastonbury Tor because the ground there had been waiting longer than Hogwarts ever had, older in its bones than the castle that had become their home, the southern counterpart to the northern node beneath Hogwarts dungeons. If the wraith had been feeding on the ambient field since the night of the pulse, summoning it the length of the country's deep currents would force it to travel further than it had ever had to travel before, a funnel built from distance itself. They climbed the Tor at dawn in early autumn, some 17 months after the world had gone silent, and began the restoration's opening sequence at the hill's grass-grown summit. The casting had been running for 20 minutes when the cold arrived. It did not announce itself the way an attack ought to announce itself. There was no flash of light, no shout of incantation. There was simply a wrongness in the warm morning air, a narrow pocket of cold pressing in against the working currents, the way a held breath pressed against a closed throat. Small, localized, and unmistakably hungry. "It's trying to get between us," Harry said, his voice low, the deep currents beneath their feet pulsing amber and steady despite the cold pressing at their edges, the way he always did. Divide and pick apart. "He can't," Hermione said. "There's nothing left between us to get between." They did not raise wands. They did not speak a countercurse. They simply opened, let the bond between them expand past every careful containment they had ever built around it, releasing the full warmth of it at once rather than holding it in reserve. The wraith, accustomed to drawing heat carefully from shadow and stillness, met instead a wall of light it had no capacity to absorb. It recoiled, and Harry stepped forward, alone, the elder wand loose in his hand, not raised, not pointed, simply present. "You spent your whole life trying to avoid death," he said, addressing the cold directly. "You called yourself powerful. You split your soul because you were afraid of something that happens to everyone who has ever lived. And this is what's left. Just hunger, just fear, just the absence of everything it means to actually be alive." The cold surged at him. He held the Elder Wand out before him, not in challenge, but turned flat against his open palm, offered the way a mirror is offered. What met the Wraith in that instant was the wand at the absolute peak of its mastery, 10 years refined into instinct, the resurrection stone pulsing in his pocket with the gathered weight of the restoration in full motion, the bond between them at its widest, brightest extension, the deep current of an entire nation, awake and alive beneath their feet. It was, in the most literal sense the Wraith's remaining instinct could process, the sum total of everything that had ever been good and powerful in the world it had once tried to consume entirely for itself. A small, dark thing met the full brightness of a star. It did not explode. It did not cry out. There was nothing left of it capable of producing a sound that dramatic. It simply ceased, unraveled at every edge simultaneously, the parasite undone by an excess of the very thing it had spent over a year quietly trying to steal. The cold lifted from the hilltop all at once, and the warm morning closed back in around them as though it had never been interrupted. "It's gone," Hermione said finally, very softly. "He was always going to end as nothing," Harry said. "He spent his whole life running from it. He just never understood that nothing was the direction he was running toward the entire time." Below them, across the wide green expanse of the Somerset levels, the morning had taken on a quality neither of them had seen in over a year. Not merely sunlight, but something underneath it. A faint and steady warmth running through the soil itself, the first true current of a magical field that was, after a long and total silence, finally alive again. It was thin. Hermione knew this even as she felt it. A seed crop scattered across fallow ground, not yet a forest. It would be years before the first new children anywhere on Earth began to show the smallest signs of what had just been planted in them. But it was alive. For the first time since the 3rd of May, the world's magic was not an echo of something gone. It was a beginning. "We did it," Harry said quietly. "We did," Hermione said, and slipped her hand into his, and for a long while, neither of them said anything else at all. The seed they had scattered across the world's deep currents needed time before it would show anything, and time, after everything, was the one resource they finally had in abundance. For the first months, following the restoration, they simply watched, and spent those months at Hogwarts restoring it stone by stone and habit by habit. Not because the castle required physical repair, so much as because the act of caring for it gave shape to days that might otherwise have felt formless. They spent the better part of 3 months afterward drawing the line between what to keep of the old world and what to set aside. What they kept, Hogwarts itself, rebuilt and reopened. The essential shape of magical education, Gringotts record-keeping, restaffed by a new system answerable to people rather than old grievances, and the ethical bones Hermione distilled into a single founding sentence. Magic is a gift, not a weapon. The weak deserve protection. Knowledge belongs to everyone who can carry it responsibly. What they discarded, blood as a category of worth, since every child who would ever show magic again was being seeded fresh into families with no wizarding history at all. The old ministry replaced by something smaller and accountable, and absolute secrecy loosened deliberately rather than abandoned recklessly. 10 years after the pulse, the first generation began to show. Hermione's instruments flagged several children across 4 continents within the same season, each one entirely without wizarding ancestry, each one the genuine first fruit of what the restoration had planted. They went to each child in turn, gently beginning always with the family rather than the child alone. The visit that stayed with both of them longest was the one in Lagos, to a mother named Gozi who had exhausted every explanation her own world had to offer for what her daughter could do. "She sets things alight," Nosy said, her arms folded tight across her chest. "Without touching them, the fire is always the color of how she feels." Hermione knelt slowly, at a careful distance, and explained, not with theory, but simply the way she might have explained something to an 11-year-old version of herself, frightened and uncertain. "There used to be a whole world of people like her," she said. "It went quiet for a while. Your daughter is one of the first signs it's coming back." Harry knelt in front of the girl, a daze, bringing himself level with her measuring stare. "Do you know what you are?" he asked her. different, she said, after a moment's serious consideration. Yes, Harry said, so are we, and we are going to make sure that being different turns out to be the best thing that's ever happened to you. The fire that flickered briefly to life in the girl's small cupped hands turned as he watched, a clear and steady gold. They returned to Hogwarts that autumn to find the castle ready in every practical sense to receive students again. Though it would be years yet before there were enough of them anywhere in the world to fill even a fraction of the house tables still standing, polished, and waiting in the great hall. The Sorting Hat sat on its stool, exactly where it had always sat, and Hermione, over 3 quiet evenings, had written it a new verse, not erasing the old houses, which she and Harry had agreed deserved their long-earned places, but adding to them. Gryffindor remained, for courage and loyalty. Ravenclaw remained, for wisdom and curiosity. Hufflepuff remained for dedication and fairness. Slytherin remained too, its history acknowledged honestly rather than scrubbed clean. Beside them stood new houses for mastery, ingenuity, and vision, a recognition of the range of excellence the new world would need to cultivate. 100 years after the Pulse, the world did not look like the one that had ended. The revelation of magic to the wider world had come decades earlier, not as confession forced by circumstance, but as a careful, negotiated unveiling Harry and Hermione had managed personally, year by patient year. By the century mark, the distinction barely mattered anymore. There was no longer a magical society and a separate ordinary one. There was simply society, one world that had, in the end, learned to absorb wonder the way it had once absorbed every other impossible thing. Harry was 117 years old. Hermione was 118. Neither of them looked it, not in any sense that aging usually meant, Harry's mastery of the Hallows tethering him to the world more slowly than time should otherwise have permitted. Hermione's century-old resonance with the deep currents she had once mapped by hand, keeping her tied to a flow that simply did not run down the way an ordinary life ran down. They knew it would not last forever, and they had made their peace with that a long time ago. The centenary fell on the 2nd of May, and the wider world marked it with a global ceremony neither of them attended. They spent the day instead at Hogwarts, in the rooms that had been their home for a century, and in the evening climbed to the astronomy tower as the sun went down, the way they had climbed it on the very first morning, 100 years and 1 lifetime ago. Below them, the grounds were full of students drawn from every continent, children who had grown up entirely inside a world that had always had magic in it, who knew nothing of the silence that had once swallowed a generation, except as a chapter in their history lessons. The council of those who had found their way to the anchoring's frame had grown with the century. Sirius, James, Lily, and Remus joined, over the long decades, by others who had found their own way back, visible now to anyone who came to look for them, in a world that had finally made its peace with the full reality of what magic was, and what it cost. "Do you ever think about it?" Hermione asked eventually. "What would have happened if it hadn't gone wrong? If we'd simply won the war the ordinary way, and everything had just continued?" "Yes," Harry said. A pause. "Less than I used to. I think about Ron. I know. I think about it and it's beautiful. And I also think, it isn't worse. What we have instead, it's different. It's ours, in a way nothing else could ever have been. This world only exists," Harry said, "because you're brilliant and I'm stubborn, and neither of us ever once agreed to stop. That," she said, "is the single most accurate summary of our entire lives. I wouldn't trade it," he said. "Any of it. Not even the terrible parts. Because every one of them led here." He looked at her, the last of the light catching in her eyes. "They led here, and to you, and to whatever still comes next." She looked back at him with a century of partnership held quietly behind her eyes. "What comes next," she said, "is supper. I told the kitchen 7 o'clock. He laughed, the sound easy and unguarded, and they stayed a while longer on the tower, as the stars came up properly overhead, Hogwarts glowing warm and full beneath them, alive with the voices of students discovering, each in their own time, exactly what they were capable of. At midnight, when the tower had gone quiet and the castle had settled fully into sleep, a figure appeared at the edge of the parapet. It did not arrive dramatically. It simply was there, the way it always was, eventually, for everyone. Not threatening, not impatient, present in the manner of something that had all the time that had ever existed and felt no need to hurry any part of it. Harry glanced toward the figure. It inclined its head slightly, an old familiar acknowledgement. Not yet. He nodded back, the same understanding passing between them that had always passed between them since a ruined hall a century ago. Not yet. There's still more to do. When he looked again, the parapet held nothing but the two of them and the wide field of stars. Was that? Hermione asked. Old friend, Harry said. Just checking in. She leaned her head against his shoulder, the geometry of it worn smooth and familiar by 100 years of practice. And below them, the world went on, students laughing somewhere in the dark of the grounds, a fire burning steady in the great hall's hearth, the lake holding the reflected stars without disturbance, the whole vast quiet machinery of everything they had built turning forward, unhurried, into whatever came after this. They had been the last of an old world. They had become the first of a new one, and they remained above everything else either had ever carried or built or lost, each other's in every sense that word could hold, for exactly as long as the world still needed them to be, which, as it turned out, was a very long time indeed. Let us know what you'd like to see next. The end.